All right, here we go. Today we have presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., son of Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, nephew of President John F. Kennedy. Welcome to VladTV.
Vlad, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, you have a very long history that actually starts before you were born. So I want to get into all that before we begin and tell your story. So you're part of the legendary Kennedy family, and your grandfather is Joseph Kennedy.
Yes.
And he had some pretty famous kids. He had John F. Kennedy, who was the 35th president of the United States, longtime Senator Ted Kennedy, and Attorney General and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, a.k.a. Bobby Kennedy, who is your father. So do you have any memory of your grandfather growing up?
Yeah. All of us were very close. The family was very close-knit. So my grandfather had 9 kids. He had how 2 of the kids died during World War II, and 1 immediately after. My Uncle Joe was killed on he volunteered for what essentially was a suicide mission. He had completed all of his, he was on his way home. He had been a pilot out of England, flying over Germany and over the Channel. And he had volunteered for a mission to fly the first remote-controlled airplane, which they had turned into a flying bomb. And they were going to he had to take it off. And then they were going to send it into the submarine pens off of Scandinavia, to the Nazi submarine pens. And his job was to take it off, get it at altitude, and another plane that was flying next to him, the companion plane, would turn on the remote control and take over the controls of the plane. Then he was supposed to parachute out. As soon as they turned it on, it sparked the bombs in it, and it disintegrated the plane immediately, and he was not found. He died during the war, and my aunt died immediately after the war in an airplane crash. The 7 kids that were left were all around Hyannisport. So my grandfather bought a house in Hyannisport in 1928. He had been the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He had been one of 10 millionaires in this country during the Great Depression. He was a banker. He owned a movie studio in one of the biggest movie studios in Hollywood, or he was the CEO of it and the biggest owner. And then he had, as I said, 9 kids. He raised them. They all had houses around his house. So that was what is called the Kennedy compound. My father bought the first of those houses. My father was one of the younger kids, was the first to get married. He had 11 kids. So I have 10 siblings, 2 of whom have died. And I grew up with my grandfather. My grandfather took us horseback riding every day. I went out he had a boat called the Marlin. It's a cabin cruiser, and we went on some boats every day. So a lot of the family had boats, and but a lot of us went with my grandfather every day. And so we had dinner with him at least one night a week, with him and my grandmother, Rose Kennedy. Incidentally, his father was a political operative. He was a ward boss for the Democratic Party in Boston. And my other great-grandfather, Rose Kennedy's father, was Honey Fitz, who was the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston.
Okay, and like you mentioned, your grandfather was extremely wealthy. The first president of the SEC. He also owned this huge building. It was like the biggest building in America.
Yeah, he owned the biggest building other than the Pentagon, which is the Merchandise Mart in Chicago.
Now, I just want to address this rumor because, from what I understand, it's not true, but there was always the rumor that he was involved in liquor bootlegging. Liquor bootlegging.
Yeah, he was not.
Right. From what I understand, from what I read, that he actually did start to export liquor after it became legal. So he wasn't actually doing it when it was illegal during the whole kind of the criminal part of it.
When the way that Prohibition ended, Prohibition was very unpopular among the Irish, particularly.
Right.
And in urban populations, it was a rural impulse, and not, in the urban populations, it was extremely unpopular. So, but my grandfather, and by the way, my grandfather went through 3 presidential appointments, including the head of the SEC, and he had a high job up in the shipbuilding for the United States Navy, and he was the ambassador to the Court of St. James to England. He had to go through Senate hearings in each one. If he had had anything to do with the liquor industry or with prohibition, he had so many political enemies, and that would have come out.
Yeah.
The way that prohibition ended is you had to have, I think you had 26 states had to disavow prohibition in order to alter the Constitution.
Yeah.
So when it got close to those 23 or 26, they knew it was coming. So he went over to Scotland and he bought Pinch vodka, or Pinch whiskey, which was one of the premier whiskey companies.
Mm-hmm.
He did it with James Roosevelt, who was the president's son.
Okay.
The two of them bought it, and then they imported to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much, but a lot of the stuff. So it was at warehouses right next to the U.S. border. So the second that prohibition ended, all the liquor came. Now, he was never accused of being a bootlegger until after he had his stroke and couldn't defend himself, and my uncle was killed. Uh-huh. It was 1964, and there was at that point, the CIA was trying to, let's say, disparage the rumors that they may have had something to do with President Kennedy's assassination. There was a big effort that was run by an individual in the CIA who had been the New York Times bureau chief in Havana. And his job for the next 30 years was blackening the Kennedy name. And that is one of the rumors that he started at that time. And it was in order to promote this story that my uncle had been killed by the mafia because he had double-crossed them, because the Giancana mob had helped him win Chicago. And then my father had prosecuted Sam Giancana and put 600 people in jail from that mob and from, the Trafficante and Carlos Marcello organizations, and that this was their revenge. So this is a nonsense story that makes no sense. In fact, when I was a little kid, in 1959, I went to, and there's pictures of me sitting in the Senate hearing room on my mother's lap in the front row. My father eviscerated Sam Giancana. So Sam Giancana, I think, took the fifth 50 times in front of my father. My father ridiculed him. My father asked him, do you hang people from who cross you from meat hooks? Have you done that? He giggled, and my father said, "You're giggling like a little girl, aren't you? Like a little girl." So Sam Giancana did not like my father. Now, what people are saying is 6 months after that hearing, somehow my father was Jack Kennedy's campaign manager. Somehow my father then cuts a deal with Sam Giancana, who he ridiculed, who he's putting in jail, who he's attacked for years, and they make up, and Sam Giancana gives my uncle the White House. It doesn't make any sense. Right. Not only that, but the people accuse another rumor that was circulating at the time was that my uncle won the presidency by conniving with Mayor Daley to fix the Chicago vote. Well, Mayor Daley fixed the Chicago vote for the lower ballot candidates all the time, so nobody disagrees with that. The problem with this is that after that vote, first of all, after the vote, Mayor Daley was so outraged about these accusations that my uncle had won unfairly that he offered to do a recount and pay for it himself. He also, even if my uncle had lost Illinois, he would have still won the presidency. So it is what it is.
It is what it is. Right. Because the rumor was always, and even when I interview mafia guys like Michael Franzese, it was like, okay, so the grandfather was the bootlegger who worked with the mafia, and then the mafia helped John F. Kennedy become president. And then when Bobby went after the mafia, they felt betrayed. So they, killed John F. Kennedy and so forth.
Yeah. And
you've heard this a million times.
I've heard it a million times. Everybody and there's a lot of writers out there who would have liked to find some evidence. There's a guy called David Horowitz who spent years looking for that evidence and finally said, yeah, it's not there. It didn't happen. My uncle had nothing to do with it. My uncle at that, right out of high school, he became the youngest bank president in the country. He wasn't bootlegging. He had a very visible life with eyeballs on him my grandfather all the time. And then he went right into politics. So, if he had he had a lot of enemies on Wall Street, all over the country. If he had been a bootlegger at any point in his life, that would have been found out at the time and would have been used against him a million times. And there's no place in his life. His life is very well known. And there's no place in his life that could have happened.
Okay, so like you mentioned, you were the third of 11 kids to Robert F. Kennedy. So you're growing up in this, very privileged, wealthy family. And when you were 6 years old, your uncle, John F. Kennedy, becomes the 35th president.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
And will, to the best of your ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
I mean, you're pretty young, but do you remember the elation of your family that someone in your family suddenly president of the United States?
I remember everything about the campaign. I came out here for the convention. It was the first time I've stayed up all night. There's pictures of me at the convention here in Los Angeles. My dad took us to Northern California for 2 days, and I caught a snake up there, and I kept that snake in my pocket. So I had him at the convention. We had one of the boxes, and I was playing with him, and there's a lot of pictures of me doing that. But I remember we were staying at the Hearst's house at, William Randolph Hearst's house when we were out here. And I remember that. I remember the fountain outside. And I remember when my uncle got, I was in the hall when my uncle was nominated as the candidate. And I watched his speech and, me and my siblings were running around the hall collecting buttons and that kind of stuff. But, we had been involved in the campaign too. We were very, very much aware. My parents were always very good about including us in everything and telling us what they're doing and telling us about the importance in history. And, so that was just part of the milieu growing up.
Okay, so John F. Kennedy becomes president, and as soon as he becomes president, he appoints his younger brother, Bobby, as U.S. Attorney General, your dad.
Yes.
So as soon as your dad becomes Attorney General, he starts this war against organized crime.
Yeah. He had already started the war.
Before that.
Yeah, because my uncle had been on the rackets committee in the United States Senate. He had been in the Senate before he became president. And my father was chief counsel of the rackets committee. So my father had, his big issue, and it was unusual for Democrats at that time. It was like a daring move for Democrats because organized crime had infiltrated organized labor, and particularly the Teamsters Union, but some of the other unions. And if you were a Democrat, you had ambitions to run for president, you needed the unions. So, people would warn my father and my uncle, don't go after the unions because you need them to win.
Yeah.
And they did it anyway. But my father really felt that it was at that time, he felt like it was the gravest threat to American democracy because the mafia had infiltrated all of these institutions that were key to our democracy, including the labor unions, but also the judiciary. They controlled a lot of judges. They owned a lot of Congress people. And he felt like it was a threat to democracy and ultimately the republic.
Well, yeah. I mean, at the time, the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, he said the mafia doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And that was based on the rumor that he was gay and they had pictures of him cross-dressing. So there was a little bit of a leverage situation.
He also had, Hoover had also relationships with some of the mobsters, and particularly Mickey Cohen, who was the chief mobster here in Los Angeles. And Hoover and his partner would come out. By partner, I mean his, romantic partner, Clive Tolson, would come out here to bet on the horse races. And we were given, vouchers by Cohen. So, and this is pretty well documented. And so that, there were other reasons that he may not wanted to have exposed the mafia, but there were individual police captains and commanders in the city police, including here in Los Angeles, who knew the mafia existed, who had active organized crime units in New York City and New Orleans and in California, and they were the only people in the country who were investigating organized crime. My father became close to those guys.
Okay, so your dad is going after the mafia, and he actually called it, his quote was, basically, there's a private government of organized crime with an annual income of billions, resting on a base of human suffering and moral corrosion. And during his time, organized crime figures, convictions rose by 800%. So he was putting a lot of people in prison. And he went after Hoffa. He had something called the Get Hoffa Squad. And him and Hoffa were almost like mortal enemies. Hoffa even said there was a blood feud between him and your dad.
Yeah.
And Hoffa eventually ended up going to prison.
And Hoffa hired people to kill my father.
Really?
Yeah, he hired a guy to shoot him in the swimming pool because my father swam every morning. And he hired and to firebomb our house to kill our whole family. And when I was a kid, our house was in a remote part of, at that time, a very remote part of Virginia, which was McLean. It was before they built the highway, Dolly Madison Highway. So it was a place where trucks would never come out there, a diesel truck, 18-wheeler. But when our house was a very large property, like 6 acres, but it was surrounded by roads and almost a square of roads. And those roads, all day long, there would be trucks going around our place, blowing their horns from the Teamsters Union. The Teamsters Union offices were right next to the Justice Department. My father famously left the Justice Department at 10 o'clock one night and was driving past the Teamsters Union offices. He looked up at there was still lights on in Hoffa's office. So he went back to the office and went back to work because he didn't want to be outworked by Hoffa. Okay. So he did have a personal blood feud with him, I would say. And, they did arrest this. One of the guys came forward who was part of this murder plot to kill my father and confessed everything.
Wow. Well, gladly nothing happened at that point. Okay, and then November 22nd, 1963, your uncle John F. Kennedy gets assassinated.
Yeah.
When you first found out, how'd you react?
I was picked up at Sidwell Friends School, and we saw the flags were being lowered to half-mast. My mother picked us up, and she said, a Batman has shot Uncle Jack. And I went home, got home probably 15 minutes later. My father was walking in the yard with John McComb, who was the head of the CIA. The CIA was only maybe 3/4 mile from my house, probably last a half mile from my house. So we used to ride horses every day through the CIA campus. It was when the building was first being constructed, and then afterward, my father would spend time there every day because of the Cuba issue. And McComb was one of the first people to arrive at the house. And my father asked McComb during that conversation, did the CIA do this to my brother? Mm. And McComb, who wouldn't have known anyway, my father and uncle had fired Allen Dulles after the Bay of Pigs. And they brought in McComb, who was a straight arrow. He was a Republican Catholic businessman. And they wanted to straight out the agency. But of course, he really didn't know what was happening at the agency. And Dulles was still running a lot of things. So my father asked him. My father actually made 2 calls that day, in addition to asking McComb. He called a friend of his who was one of the leaders of the Cuban Brigade, a guy was the Bay of Pigs Brigade, called Harry Ruiz, who was a perennial figure around my house. He was in a hotel in Washington. He asked him, did your people do this? Did the Cubans do this? The CIA Cubans? And he called the desk officer at the CIA and asked them the same thing. So that was my father's initial impulse. And when I got home, I went down with my brother, Joe, and me. We all got home at once, and David, and we went down and, hugged my father. And we stood at the bottom of the hill, at Hickory Hill, where our house was at the top of a long grassy hill, and there was a tree at the bottom of it. And we all just stood there for a long time. My father was just totally shattered.
Yeah. Well, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the murder, but before he can go to trial, he got killed by Jack Ruby.
Yeah.
I mean, and this has been a conspiracy, for decades at this point. Based on what you know as being part of the Kennedy family, was it just Lee Harvey Oswald? Was it multiple people? What do you think actually happened?
Well, first of all, when I was standing in the White House, in the East Room of the White House, next to my uncle's casket, when President Johnson came in and told my mother and my Aunt Jackie and my dad, who were all standing next to me, that a man named Jack Ruby had killed Lee Harvey Oswald. And I said to my mom at that time, I said, why did he do that? Did he love our family? Because it made no sense to me. Why would you kill somebody? And, it didn't make any sense to anybody. Why would you go in broad daylight to the police station and risk your life? And he later said that he did it to spare Jackie the anguish of a long trial. Well, he had never said anything nice about Jackie and his wife. He worked for the mafia. He ran a strip club that had what they call B girls, which were girls that would change, every 2 weeks or months, and a new group would be brought in. And those girls went to these B clubs all over the country, all over the Southwest. And they were part of a, stable that was part of Carlos Marcello's organization. Carlos Marcello was the New Orleans mob boss who also, Dallas was in his district. And he was deeply involved in Cuba. Him, Santos Traficante, Sam Giancana, and Carlos Marcello all had casinos in Havana that Castro had shut down. So they were all tied in with the CIA's efforts to kill Castro. And that's how they all got involved. Now, you asked me what I think happened. I mean, the Warren Commission said that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone shooter, and nothing about Lee Harvey Oswald's life or the evidence. There was so much evidence, even at that time, when it was just a tip of the iceberg, that could not have possibly been true. But then in 1979, Congress spent a year and a half, a congressional committee, the House Select Assassinations Committee, in fact, 2 congressional committees, spent a year and a half investigating, and they had a lot more documents and a lot more witnesses than the Warren Commission had, and they came to the conclusion that my uncle was killed by a conspiracy. The lead investigator was a guy called Bob Blakey, and Bob Blakey is now a professor, law professor. He believed that it was more likely the mafia. This is before they knew that the mafia and the CIA had merged. But he believed that it was more likely the mafia. Almost everybody on his staff and the senator who actually started the investigation, a senator called Schweitzer, all believed that the CIA was the principal culprit. But the the conclusion, the official conclusion in the congressional record was that John F. Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy. Blakey has since changed his opinion, and Blakey now believes that the CIA was involved because so much other. I would say there's so much evidence that it is that of CIA involvement, not only with my uncle's murder, but then with the 60-year cover-up. There's including probably 20 confessions of people who were involved. A lot of them were deathbed confessions, but key figures like David Morales, like David Atlee Phillips, like E. Howard Hunt, people who were involved in the planning, the execution, people who were present. Woody Harrelson's dad was involved in the assassination, and he confessed multiple times.
Woody Harrelson's dad was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
He was not a shooter. What he said his role was bringing, when the shooting started on from the grassy knoll, a big crowd of people saw the smoke coming up, and they ran up to look at it, to see what was the source of it. And Secret Service men suddenly appeared on the hill and pushed them all down and said, "You can't come up here." The Secret Service later said there were no Secret Service people on that hill. Charles Harrelson's function was to deliver the Secret Service badges to a group of people on the hill. What he says, and what a lot of people say who were there that day, is that they did not know it was going to be assassination. That they knew there was going to be an incident, but they never imagined it would be a murder. And a lot of those people then realized that they were part of this, conspiracy in the death of the president. And they kind of scattered. A lot of them were subsequently murdered themselves, including the key members, Johnny Roselli, who the day that he was the liaison between the CIA and the mafia, the three mafia chiefs. The day that he was subpoenaed by the House Assassination Committee, he disappeared. Was found a week later, chopped into small pieces in a oil drum in Biscayne Bay in Miami. And Sam Giancana, when he was subpoenaed to testify, the mob boss, the Chicago outfit boss, he was subpoenaed to testify for that committee, and he was murdered in his basement by an assassin. So there's over 30 people who were killed, who were witnesses or potential witnesses. And then a lot of people have confessed. Woody's dad, was a very, very charismatic guy, and I'm very close to Woody, and we've talked about this. He actually confessed for the first time while he was in a police shootout. So he was a professional hitman. He had worked for the CIA. He had been recruited out of the military, worked for the CIA, and then worked for the Carlos Marcello mob. And he died in maximum security prison for the murder of a federal judge. But he was a very, very interesting character, and he confessed at one time. But then he told Woody the story, which Woody told me, and also there's photographs of him at the site that day.
Wow.
If you go on Google and put up three tramps, JFK assassination Dallas, his picture will come up.
Okay. Yep, I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah.
I mean, so if it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald working by himself, what do you think was the motive behind your uncle getting killed?
It was people who were, it was a group from the CIA who had been involved in Miami, who were angry at my uncle, felt my uncle committed treason, first of all, in the Bay of Pigs by not sending air cover. And then after the Cuban Missile Crisis, my uncle had established this very close relationship with Khrushchev. Mm. And Khrushchev...
Who was the head of Russia at the time?
Who was the head of Russia. And Khrushchev and they knew they couldn't trust the people around them and the intelligence apparatus and the military. They were both in the same position. They were both war heroes who'd seen the bloodiest part of war. Khrushchev was going to be purged by Stalin, and he had been in Stalingrad which was the worst war. That was the worst battle in World War II. I mean, the worst.
Yeah.
So, and he had been in the middle of it. He did not ever want to go to war again. He didn't want to, but he was surrounded by people, as was Jack, who believed that war was not only inevitable, but it was the sooner the better. And so they figured out halfway through, 2 years in, they figured out they had to start talking to each other individually. My uncle installed a hot phone at the White House, another one at the Cape, which was red. We knew if we touched that Khrushchev would answer. So we were told not to touch that one. And there's still my brother owns that house right now, and the wires to that phone are still sticking out of the wall. But Jack also started exchanging these letters with him, which were smuggled to him by a Soviet spy called Georgy Bolshoi, who was at our house all the time. We loved him. We knew he was a KGB spy and GRU spy, but he could do rope climbing with his. He was like a fire. He was built like a fire hydrant, but very powerful. He used to do push-up contests with my father. He'd do rope climbing contests. He knew how to do the Cossack dancing, and so we loved him. But he began smuggling these letters from Khrushchev. Trusted him. My uncle, my dad trusted him. And he began to smuggle these letters. The first one he smuggled in was folded in a New York Times, and they exchanged these very, very extraordinary personal letters talking about how they needed to stay out of war. And so Khrushchev then, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev had called Castro to come and spend time with him. And Castro spent several months with Khrushchev in Russia, and Khrushchev had urged him to make peace with my uncle. Castro had reached out to my uncle immediately after that. The day that my uncle died, Castro was meeting with his emissary at Veradero Beach in Cuba, talking about the format to end the embargoes, which my uncle made it clear to him. I don't care what kind of government you have. It can be Marxist, communist. That's not our business. We don't want Soviet. We don't want you to be a Soviet base. Mm-hmm. So all Soviet military out, and we want you to stop Che Guevara from going in and making problems with the Alliance for Progress countries in Latin America. And that's all he wanted. Yeah. And Castro agreed to that. That afternoon, he received a call. I picked up the call, and my uncle's emissary was sitting there. And he said to him, "It's over. President Kennedy's been shot." So, they knew, my uncle did it behind the backs of the State Department, but they knew. The CIA knew what was happening. And my uncle, 30 days before his death, on October 22nd, 1963, he signed Executive Order 263, ordering all U.S. troops home from Vietnam. So he ended the Vietnam War. With the first 1,000 coming home in December, there was only 16,000 troops and advisors. They weren't allowed to participate in combat. He found out they had been, and 75 had died. And he said that morning, he said, "No more, we're done." And he ordered them all home. And 30 days after that, he was killed. So, and Vietnam was a CIA project, from beginning to end. So there were people in the agency, and we know who they were. It was David Hadley Phillips. It was Bill Harvey. It was E. Howard Hunt. It was Alan Dulles. It was James Jesus Angleton. We know the shooters. They were, 3 men from who had been in Batista's battalions in Cuba, and who later, died under different circumstances. One of them died in a prison in Cuba, imprisoned by Castro. But you asked me what I think. What I would say is I'm an attorney. I've tried hundreds of cases. I was a district attorney. If I had to prove my case that the CIA murdered my uncle, I'm very confident, just on the evidence that is out there now, that would be very, very easy to prove in front of any jury in America. Now, people shouldn't trust me on this. I'm not trying to convince anybody. People need to do their own research about everything. You live in a democracy, make up your own mind. But, one thing my father told me, people in authority lie. And, part of the duty of living in a democracy is to maintain a posture of constant skepticism toward any aggregation of power. And, trusting the experts is not something you do in a democracy. That's not a feature of democracy or science. It's a feature of religion and totalitarianism. It's not a thing. Mm-hmm. The thing that we were all told to do. You need to do your own research. And for people who are curious about this, the best book that you can read is a book by Jim Douglas called The Unspeakable. And he has, in a riveting way, with poetic writing, distilled millions of pages of documents and all of these confessions and all of the evidence and put it in one really beautifully written story in this book. And if you pick it up, you won't be able to put it down. But it's a brilliant book, and it probably has 1,000 footnotes in it.
Okay, so let's fast forward to 1968. You're 14 years old at the time, and you're in boarding school at the Georgetown Preparatory School in Maryland. Your father, Bobby Kennedy, is running for the presidential nomination with the Democrats. And during this process, on June 5th, 1968, he was at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. As he was leaving the ballroom, he decided to go through the kitchen. And I guess his bodyguard, FBI agent Bill Barry, told him to avoid the kitchen because it was very crowded. As he was going through, shaking hands with everyone, a 24-year-old Palestinian man named Saran shot him with a .22 caliber revolver. He was hit 3 times. 5 other people were wounded as well. When you found out that your dad had gotten killed, what went through your mind?
Well, first of all, I would dispute that description of what happened.
Okay.
I don't believe that Sirhan's bullets ever hit my father.
Okay.
And neither did the coroner, Thomas Noguchi, who is probably the most famous coroner in American history, who did an autopsy that is known as the perfect autopsy. He actually flew in the chief coroners of all the every branch of the military service to sit in the surgery theater to watch what he did because he knew what had happened in Dallas. And he didn't want to repeat. And what he found, Sirhan had 8 shots. He had a .22 revolver, or 8 shots in it. And he fired 2 shots at my father. One of those shots hit Paul Schrade, who was the UAW, the United Auto Workers deputy chief. There was only 2 unions that supported my father, the United Auto Workers and Cesar Chavez Union. And Paul Schrade had recruited Cesar Chavez to the United Farm Workers. So he was very close to my dad. He got shot in the head. And he was okay. And, he actually died a year and a half ago and spent the last 20 years of his life trying to get Sirhan out of prison, the man who shot him. The other shot went past my father's head and hit a door jamb behind him, and it was later removed by the LAPD. It was dug out of the door jamb. The whole door jamb was removed. He was then pounced upon by 6 men, including Rafer Johnson, who was the 1960 decathlon champion, gold medal Olympian, one of my father's closest friends, and Rosie Greer, who was one of the, fearsome foursome, who had been a bodyguard for my dad. He was, one of the most famous football players of his time. And 4 other people, including the guy who was the director or the concierge of the Ambassador Hotel. And they pounced on him. They took his hand and pointed away from my father. So they pointed the opposite direction. Rafer Johnson later told me that he tried to get the gun out of Sirhan's hand, but Sirhan had superhuman strength. He's a little tiny man. I've met him. I spent
5'5", I think.
Yeah, he's tiny. But he couldn't, this big, Rafer is like 6'4" and solid muscle. He could not get and you had a professional lineman from, the Oakland Raiders there that day. And they couldn't get it. So he fires 6 more shots in the opposite direction and empties the chamber of his gun. He's always in front of my father, by the way. My father, he's sitting with his back to his steam table, and they bent him over the steam table. And he fired the bullets this way. As you pointed out, those bullets each hit people. So 5 people, one of them got hit twice. So if you just do the math, my father got shot 4 times from behind. And he only hit 8 bullets in his gun. He didn't reload. We know what happened to the first 2, and we know what happened to the second 6. We know what happened to every one of those bullets. My father was killed from behind. He was shot 4 times. One of the shots went harmlessly through the shoulder pad of his suit. The other 3 were fatal or potentially fatal. And one of them was right behind his ear. All of them were contact shots. That's what Thomas Noguchi found, meaning the barrel of the gun was either touching his skin or his clothing and was and left a carbon tattoo, or was close enough, within an inch, close enough to leave a carbon tattoo. And the gun was being held at an upward angle. So he was shot from behind by somebody who was standing behind him with the gun pressed between the 2 of them and firing. And that man was almost certainly Eugene Thane Cesar, who was a security guard who had been hired the day before. So they already knew when he got the job, he already knew my father was going to be at that hotel. His full-time job was at the Lockheed plant. And before that, he had worked at another defense plant, which was Howard Hughes' company. And he had top security classifications at that plant. Lisa Pease, who's a researcher, has found documents where he self-identifies as a CIA agent. He ended up leaving the country. He was very outspoken against my father. He believed that my father would start a race war, and my father would put blacks in charge of the country, and he hated blacks. And he ended up leaving the country. He died about 1.5 years ago in the Philippines. Before he died, I tried to go over there and interview him. He originally said that it would cost me $10,000, but he would do it. And then when I got close to going, he said it's going to be 15. And then a day before I left, he said it's going to be 25,000. So then I thought he's playing a game.
Yeah.
And I ended up not going. But I can't prove that my father was killed by the CIA. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. And then, there's a lot of other circumstantial evidence, and particularly with Sirhan's background and his trial, there's a lot of, and the cover-up. There was a lot of agency involvement.
Sirhan did an interview in 1980. He said that it was a combination of liquor and anger over the anniversary of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War that triggered what he did. He said, that night I went to observe the Jewish Zionist parade in celebration of the June 5th, 1967 victory over the Arabs. That was the catalyst that triggered me on that night. In addition, there was the consumption of liquor, and I want the public to understand that. So he felt that it was the Arab-Israeli conflict and a whole lot of liquor that kind of caused that. But you actually flew down and talked to him in prison at one point, right?
Yeah.
And what did he tell you?
He said about that night, he said the same thing that he's consistently said for, 50 years, that he has no memory of what happened that night.
He's still alive today.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what he told you. He just said, I don't remember.
He didn't remember what happened that night. He does not believe at this point that he did it.
Okay.
And what he's always said is, they told me they did it, that I did it. I don't have any memory of doing it,
Yeah.
but, I assume that I did it. And he also, he's a very kind of sweet old man. He cried when he talked about the impact of it on, he knows he was involved in it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no doubt about that. But he cried when he talked about my mom and, about seeing all of us when we were growing up without a dad.
Well, yeah, I mean, you lost your uncle a few years before then, but now this is your dad.
Yeah.
How badly did this affect you?
What is the comparison? People lose their parents all the time.
Yeah, but not under circumstances like this normally.
Yeah, I'm not trying to argue that it didn't have an impact on me. Clearly, it had an impact on me and on my life, and it had an impact on the whole country. A dramatic impact, I would say, on the country. And the direction that we took after his death, with Nixon getting elected, and what happened that summer with the riots in Chicago. In terms of, the impact on me, well, there's lots of people who lose their parents. I feel like I had an advantage over most people because, my father left a really clear moral milestones for me, and he was a heroic figure, so it gave me something to live up to. It wasn't, I think it would be much more difficult if I was, a black kid in Watts whose father got, shot in a gang shootout or something like that, and then, where's your role model? So, and then I had a big family that came together. I had deep religious faith that, helps you through, any kind of, helps you process any kind of crisis like that or any kind of tragedy. And then I had, we just had mechanisms for doing it. I mean, we had been through tragedy before, and we had, I think, a very, very loving family. My mom, at one point, said, I was asking her when one of my brothers was killed. I asked her, I said, do you think that hole that you leave, that they leave inside of you when they die, do you think that ever gets better? That it ever gets any smaller? And she said, it doesn't get any smaller. What your job is to grow yourself bigger around the hole. You have to take the best parts of that person's character and integrate it into your own life through discipline, through restraint. And in doing that, we make ourselves bigger and the whole gets proportionally smaller. And so, I was living in a milieu where those kind of lessons were part of our daily lives. And I think they gave me an advantage in processing that tragedy that, other people in less enriched environments probably wouldn't have.
Well, after that situation, you were expelled from 2 different boarding schools for using drugs. Did the drug use start after your dad died?
One of them was for a lady friend that I had.
Okay.
But I'm not saying I wasn't doing drugs at the time, but
Okay.
it was, I started doing drugs after my dad died.
Okay, to try to cope with the loss?
Oh, who knows? I mean,
Yeah.
I feel honestly that I was born an addict, and that, I would have, no matter what happened, I probably would have gone that way. But who knows? There's no way to reconstruct that. But I feel like a lot of the things that I had ADHD when I was a kid, and that I had a big empty hole inside of myself. And that, I couldn't focus, I couldn't concentrate. The minute I started taking drugs, I became calm and I was able to focus, and I actually started doing really well in school. Oh, I think I was medicating various issues that I had. And, and if the medication still worked, I'd still be doing it. After, you do it for a while, particularly I was using heroin. It turns on you, and it works for a while. It solves all your problems for a little while,
Right.
and then it's like dancing with a gorilla. You figure out that you're not stopping until the gorilla gets tired of it.
I've never heard that before. That's a good comparison. That next year, your grandfather dies.
Yeah, my grandfather had a stroke in 62.
Oh, okay. So
he was disabled after that and really never talked again. He never had a normal conversation. He could only grunt.
okay, so it took, you had already prepared yourself for that over the course of 7 years.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, after getting kicked out of a couple of schools, you end up getting into Harvard.
Yeah.
Most people who get expelled from schools don't get into Harvard. Can you explain how you accomplished that?
I was a top student in my class for the last 2 years of school. And, I had a good academic record. That's one reason I'm sure that, Harvard looked at the fact that my dad had been a presidential candidate, that, I had generations of Kennedys. My grandfather had been to Harvard.
Okay.
My father had been to Harvard. My uncle had been to Harvard. And so, they favor legacies, but, so I would say there are a lot of factors and it was a lot easier to get into Harvard back then than it is right now.
Yeah. Okay. So you go to Harvard, you graduate with a bachelor's in American history and literature. Then you go to London School of Economics, and then you go to Virginia Law School where you get your law degree, and then a master's of law from Pace University. So you really take the whole school thing very seriously moving forward. At one point, didn't you have problems passing the bar?
Yeah, I failed the bar by 1 point.
Okay.
I got 659 out of 660, but they didn't say that in the newspaper articles. They just said, idiot, flunks bar. Anyway, that's one of the downsides of celebrity.
Okay.
And by the way, I was a heroin addict at that point.
Well, right, because in 1983, when you were 29 years old, you were charged with heroin possession.
Yeah.
Was that a turning point? Because now it's out in the public, and you're a Kennedy,
I mean, one of the problems I had, Vlad, was, there was because of the strictures that I'd grown up in, that anytime anything bad, you tell anything bad, it's going to. You tell anybody any secrets about yourself, it's going to get in the press. So the idea of going into a 12-step meeting and start being truthful to people was, I'd just as soon go, swim to the bottom of the ocean and, try to breathe. I just wouldn't do it. So, but all of a sudden, everybody knew I was a drug addict. And it gave me the freedom to actually get help. And, I immediately, I'd say I immediately had a spiritual realignment because I was able to go in and be honest for the first time in my life. It wasn't just not having to do drugs, but it was not having to lie anymore and to hide things, that I could just be, who I was and be honest.
Well, right. You got 2 years probation and community service, and you went into a drug treatment center, like you mentioned. Was that the point that you kicked drugs?
Yeah.
A lot of people try to kick, though, and then they come back, they come back to it, situations happen. What do you think was the secret to you actually kicking drugs so long ago and not going back?
Because I came into the 12-step program and I gave up control. I didn't, they say in 12-step programs, they say half measures avail us nothing, which seems unfair because half measures should avail us half. Right? But if you don't completely commit to it, if you commit 100%, it's guaranteed to work. And I committed 100%. I said, whatever I need to do to get sober, I'm going to do. And I was so done with I didn't like it. For 14 years, I've been trying to quit. Oh, I started doing, shooting heroin when I was 15 years old. And but I always was trying to quit. I was always doing it without my own permission. I was always doing it. Again, I knew I was living against conscience. I knew that this is not what I wanted to do with my life. And the weird thing is I had iron willpower in every other area of my life. Like I gave up candy for Lent when I was 14, and I never ate candy again until I was in college. I gave up desserts about the same time. And I never ate a dessert again until I was a freshman in college. I was playing sports. I was playing rugby, and I was trying to bulk up, and I started eating desserts again. But I felt like I could do anything with my willpower. But this compulsion was impervious to will. I would tell myself at 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm never going to do that again. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd be doing it. And, it was to me, the most demoralizing feature of addiction, of the disease, was my incapacity to keep contract with myself. I was baffled and completely demoralized by it. So when I finally got the opportunity to be sober, I just said, whatever I need to do to make this work, I'm going to do. And I did. That's what I did. And my desire for drugs and alcohol was just lifted. And it was as if I had never been a drug addict. It was a miracle. It was as big a miracle to me as if I'd been suddenly able to walk on water.
Congratulations. Heroin is one of the worst drugs from everyone I've talked to. And that's the hardest one to kick. So congrats on actually kicking it for that long.
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather be addicted to heroin than crack cocaine if we want to get into the weeds.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so you sobered up, you passed the bar, and that's when you started your whole environmental enforcement lawsuit and, what basically carried you on for many decades.
Yeah.
What really was the motivation to really go after people that were ruining the environment?
Well, I always, first of all, I was always an outdoors person. And that, my father raised us. We were doing whitewater kayaking on the biggest, rivers in the country from when we were really young. And this was a time when people, normal people were not doing whitewater. It was before it became kind of, something that people do on weekends. It was a commitment. And, I was fishing from when I was a little kid, and I was training hawks from when I was 9 years old and hunting with them. And so I was like in the woods all the time. And this is where I felt, the one place I felt calm. And when I was a kid, the Eisenhower's highway program was kicking off, and they built a highway right next to my house. They built it through the pond where I was catching frogs and fishing, and, they just plowed it over. And I was like, this is like theft. They just ruined this place. They stole it from the public. It was, and that's how that's how I viewed environmental injury. I viewed it as a theft of the common, a privatization of the commons, of the things that, we're all supposed to share, like air, water, wildlife, fisheries, public lands. The law says, and this ancient law, it goes back to the Code of Justinian, these assets that by their nature are, the assets of the entire community that you can't privatize, are not susceptible to private property ownership: air, water, wildlife, fisheries, public lands, aquifers, national forests, all these. They belong to the people. Everybody has a right to use them. Nobody can use them in a way that will diminish or injure their use and enjoyment by others. Under the Code of Justinian, which was the law, the first kind of effort at constitutional government, if you were a citizen of Rome, whether you were rich or poor, humble or noble, African or European, you had an absolute right to cross a beach, throw in a net, and take out your share of the fish. The emperor himself couldn't stop you. And that was just one of the rights of living in a republic. And what you see is that when democracy and a republic declines, their powerful entities within society will immediately move to privatize the public trust. And that's what pollution is. It's a way of General Electric, the Constitution of the state of New York says that all the fish in the Hudson River belong to the people of New York. Every kid in New York, every black kid in Harlem has an absolute right to throw in a plug and pull out a striped bass and bring it home and feed it to their family. But they can't do that anymore because General Electric privatized every fish in the river by dumping PCBs into them, so they're now too dangerous to eat. So they, in order to avoid one of the costs of bringing their product to market, they dump their waste into the Hudson and they privatize every fish in the river. And that's what all pollution is. Somebody privatizing the air that my children, I had 4 kids with asthma. On bad air days, they got a tax. So the air was being privatized, stolen from them. And that's how I always looked at it. I went to work for commercial fishermen on the Hudson River and recreational fishermen and figured out new ways to start suing polluters. And, we built this organization called Riverkeeper we helped restore the river. And today the Hudson is an international model for ecosystem protection. It's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. It's the last river system left in the North Atlantic that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson has inspired the creation of river keepers and water keepers all over. We have one here on Santa Monica Bay. Each one has a patrol boat. We have 350 organizations. Each one is a patrol boat. They each have a full-time paid waterkeeper, and they sue polluters and enforce the law because it's illegal to pollute. But the law doesn't get enforced, so that's what we do. And we're now the biggest water protection group in the world.
Well, you said that poor communities get most of the burden of environmental pollution.
Yeah.
You said polluters always choose the soft target of poverty. And you've also said that Chicago's South Side has the highest concentration of toxic waste dumps in America.
Uncontrolled toxic waste. That's my first case was representing NAACP of Austining against the city of Austining, which was trying to put a waste transfer facility in the oldest Black neighborhood in the Hudson Valley. And when I started fighting that case, I started looking around and saying, oh, this is what always happens. 4 out of every 5 toxic waste dumps in America is in a Black neighborhood. The highest concentration of toxic waste dumps is in the country is Southside Chicago. The biggest waste dump in our country is Emile, Alabama, which is 85% Black. The most contaminated zip code here in California is East LA. And you can go on with that, and probably the biggest, problem in the Black community is, chronic disease and toxins that are poisoning this generation of kids, including 44% of Black children in urban areas have dangerous levels of lead in their blood. They're getting mercury toxicity. It lowers IQ and it destroys your executive function, your capacity to regulate your own behavior. A lot of these toxins make kids ADD and ADHD, and they have a lot of other damaging impacts.
Well, in 1994, you married Mary Kathleen Richardson. You guys had 4 kids together. In 2010, you guys got divorced. In 2012, she ended up committing suicide. According to reports, it said that she had found a personal journal of yours where you had written down various sexual encounters with 37 different women. And that possibly triggered her to take her own life. Would you care to comment on that at all?
Yeah. It's hard. First of all,
I'm sorry for your loss, by the way. This is your mother, your kid's mother.
Yeah, I was not divorced at the time, by the way. I filed for divorce in 2012, but, Mary was having a hard time. And I actually, in 2014, when she took her own life, I found her and I cut her down. She had hanged herself in our.
You actually found her like that?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was heartbreaking. And, I had a lot of my children at that time were very vulnerable, and they had been through 5 years of very, very difficult times. And Mary was an amazing woman, and she was a very, very good mother to them. But her mental condition began deteriorating, in those last years. And those kids experienced a lot of that. And, all of those kids, I think, were at risk at that time. They've all turned into amazing, amazing kids. They're all they all do well in school and colleges. They have wonderful friendships. They have wonderful relationships. And they've excelled in their lives, which is a miracle. And I'm very grateful to my wife, Cheryl, who became a mother to them. Just so that, I would say this in all cases, that people who are healthy and have strong, who are strong emotionally, no matter what other people do to them or what other people's behaviors, they don't take their own lives. And I'm sure many of the things that I did hurt Mary in different ways. But people take their lives for complex reasons and because of mental illness. One of the in the program that I'm in, the journal that you're talking about is called Your Fifth Step.
Oh, so it was part of the drug treatment journal?
It was part of my, my recovery. And
I was wondering why someone would write this down.
Well, I didn't write. It also was, there weren't like names of people and all of those. In the way that the newspapers reported that to make it look like, it was keeping kind of a, notches on the trigger. That's
right.
Not what it was. It was my own, way of trying to live and examine life and struggling with an issue that I was struggling with at that time. And I kept that fifth step in a safe. And somehow in the place where she was, she put a lot of effort into getting that safe open and then handing that to her sisters with instruction that if anything happened to her, it should be published in the press. And then shortly after that, she took her own life. Oh, it's a tragedy for, listen, I take responsibility for my own conduct. But it was part of a long history of difficulty.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people.
Well, in 1995, you developed a spasmodic dysphonia.
Yeah.
Which is why your voice sounds the way it does right now. You had an operation for this at one point, right?
I went about a year ago. I went to, not even a year, I'd say 7 months ago, I went to Japan, to Kyoto, to get a surgery, a procedure that they developed there and that is not available here in the United States. And it basically is my brain, it's a neurological injury. So my brain is telling my vocal cords to tighten up. And they were so tight that they were touching each other and no air could get through. So a lot of times I'd go to speak and nothing would come out. And I never knew when I went to speak what was going to happen. And I went over there. The surgery was, they do the surgery on you when you're awake. And what they do is they put a titanium bridge between your vocal cords to keep them separate so that air can pass through. And they do it, when you're awake and you actually try on a whole bunch of different voices. So Cheryl was in the room with me when we did it until the blood made her leave the room. But she was listening to the voices with me and kind of selecting which one because some of them, your voice actually smooths out when it's a higher pitch, but then, you get
this high-pitched voice, yeah.
Yeah, then you have a high-pitched voice. So I had to decide. Anyway, I also, and I think that really helped me a lot. I came home, I've done a lot of functional medicine stuff, and I've worked with a chiropractor, and I've worked with a lot of other people. And I think my voice now is getting better and better. And I think part of it was the surgery, but also part of it is the therapies that I'm doing now.
Well, in 1996, you actually met with Fidel Castro, and you went out to Cuba to meet with him there?
Yeah. I met with him on other occasions as well.
Okay. And I guess you guys spent a long time talking, and he said that he thinks the world would have been a better place had your father and your uncle lived, because like you had mentioned earlier, there was talks about a better situation with Cuba. I mean, the embargo, is it even lifted? Didn't Obama lift the embargo, or?
It's there's some of it is lifted, but it's still
somewhat there. You can't freely travel to Cuba completely the way you could travel to like Canada or Mexico.
I don't know what you can do now. When I went there, you needed a special permission. If you wanted to go legally, you needed to go have a special permission from the U.S. government, and I went legally. A lot of other people would go by going down to the Dominican Republic or Mexico, and they can immigrate then, and Cuba would cooperate by not stamping your passport.
What was Castro like in person?
He was incredibly charming. In fact, I went with Cheryl, and we spent a day with him and my kids, I don't know, about 2 years before he died. And he was very, very kind to me and to my family. And, he had a very open, engaged mind. And I talked to him about a million things. I talked to him about the assassinations. I talked to him about the U.S. attempts to assassinate him. I talked to him about, he was a really big scuba diver. And I took my whole family there and spent 10 days. He preserved an area called Gardens of the Queen, south of Cuba. That's one of the biggest preserved ocean areas in the world. And it's probably the best coral reef. It's arguable. It's probably in the Atlantic, at least, is the best coral reef, because it's like going diving in the 1950s, which I did. I started diving when I was 6 years old, and I've seen the deterioration of the reefs all around the world. And you go there, and it's like going back to the 1950s, because he preserved it. He was very, very close to Jacques Cousteau, and Jacques Cousteau had talked him into taking this step of preserving it, making it so there's no fishing in there. There's a very, very limited entry. And, we went on, Cheryl and I, and the kids went on a Cuban boat that went out there for 10 days. You sleep on the boat and you dive 2 or 3 times a day. And before we went, we spent a day with Castro. And, he told us about all of his diving adventures. He also my kids were very interested in the history of Cuba, and he talked about Batista and talked about, my kids asked him, my son Aiden, he wrote letters to my kids, all my kids afterwards, very lengthy letters, and sent us whole pictures that one of his sons had taken there. We asked them, my son Aiden asked him, how did you decide? He had come across from Mexico on a yacht. It was a big cabin cruiser. I think it was like 52 feet long, called the Grandma, and it was leaky. It was an old kind of, it looked like the African Queen. It was kind of a smoking hulk of a ship. And he'd come across from Mexico to get up to the Sierra Maestre, and they had brought 63 men with them. There were a lot of revolutionaries in Cuba at that time, and they were different ilks. Some of them were Marxists, some of them were Democratic. My son asked him, how did you choose which men to bring? Did you just try to bring the ones who were hardcore Marxists? And he said, no, we just brought the smallest one, because that's how we fit everybody on. And Castro himself is huge. He's like 6 foot, 3, and very, he's kind of a formidable guy. Anyway, I talked to him about that. I talked to him the first time I went down there, I was trying to talk him into halting construction on a nuclear power plant. Mm-hmm. And we were showing technology to him about burning the bagasse, which is the waste product of their sugar mills, and how he could, which is just burned openly in Cuba, because they have to get rid of all the cane after they squeeze the sugar out of it. And what we showed him is that he could use that. There was these new European turbines that have been invented that could burn the bagasse and generate the same amount ultimately of power that he was at that point getting was anticipated to get from the nuclear power plant, and he wouldn't have to. It was the same plant that was the Chernobyl design.
Oh, okay.
We were asking him not to build it.
Yeah.
And ultimately, he halted construction.
Well, in 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. dies in a small plane crash. Were you close to him at all?
Very close. In
Very
fact,
close.
I was waiting for him. I was supposed to have dinner with him that night.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah, I was waiting for him at his house in the Cape, for him and Carolyn, and it got later and later, and then I just started having a bad feeling, that night, and it was one of those things when that it's a bad news, and yeah, we were very, very close.
Sorry for your loss. Because of that, along with your father and your uncle, people started to coin it the Kennedy curse. Does that bother you when you hear that?
It doesn't bother me. I mean, I don't put any stock in it. I don't. It's not something that I tell people don't talk about the Kennedy curse. I mean, a lot of people in my family have died young.
Yeah.
My uncle said about my cousin John, he said he had every gift except for gray hair. That God gave him every gift but gray hair. And I think that can be said true of a lot of members of my family.
Yeah. Well, in 2000, you endorsed Vice President Al Gore for his presidential campaign. Were you surprised that he didn't win?
Yes, I was surprised. And I wrote an article, actually an award-winning article for Rolling Stone, raising doubts about the legitimacy of that election because of the voter suppression and voting fraud that took place in 6 Ohio counties.
Right. I mean, when you compare it to what happened with Donald Trump, do you think that there was election interference, or do you think that Trump...
I really don't know. I mean, my suspicion is that there was that the election results are legitimate. That's my prejudice. But I really don't. I wouldn't make that assertion without having really looked into it, and it's not something that I looked into. What I don't think is right. I don't think it's a threat to democracy for people to say the election was fixed. I mean, we said it in 2001. It was fixed. Bush Gore. And Bush Gore was 2001. It was Kerry who, in 2004 that I won that I wrote that article about.
Right.
So I thought the election was fixed in 2004, that it was, we got the wrong result. I think that everybody agrees that 2001 was fixed. And so I think the election systems are broken. We need to change the way that we can't rely just on machines. We need paper ballots. And then there's other changes that we ought to make. I mean, we have a whole city called Las Vegas that was built on, the capacity of machines to count right and not make mistakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's ATMs on every corner in every city in this country
Right.
that never give you too much money. So we know how to make a machine that can count right. And it's our election system. We're supposed to be the world's exemplary democracy, right? So, number one, we should have machines that everybody has faith in that can't be hacked, and I don't, you could probably hack an ATM. I don't know. But, you don't hear about it a lot. So somehow those machines are built, I mean, they wouldn't be there if they were easy to hack, right? The banks wouldn't keep them there. We must be able to build a machine that can't be hacked. And we also ought to have the safeguard of having paper ballots at every voting booth. And then, I have one of the things that I'm going to do as president is I'm going to make passport cards available to every American who can't afford them for free. That will allow us to demand ID at the voting booth, which Democrats don't like. Laws that require voter ID because a lot of their constituents don't have driver's license. Blacks in the cities, a lot of particularly young black people do not have driver's license because they don't need them. There's elderly people all over the country who have expired driver's license, and so they don't get a new one. And there are a lot of students in the country and young people who don't have their licenses. So Democrats don't like laws that say you need a driver's license or you need a picture ID to get, to vote, because they think that's going to disenfranchise their principal constituents. Republicans, in turn, have anxiety that there's cheating going on, there's voter fraud, and there's an easy way to solve this for everybody, which is right now it costs $65 to get a federally issued photo ID, which is a passport card, just the card. It's not the book, it's the card. What I'm going to do is I'm going to waive that fee. That's a barrier to a lot of people. I'm going to waive that fee so that anybody can go to any local post office and with proof of citizenship and get that ID. What does that do? Here's what it does. Number one, it gets the Democratic powerhouses. I mean, Andrew Young's already agreed to this. The civil rights leaders, Al Sharpton and others, have said if we do that, they will drop their objections to a requirement of photo ID at the voting booth. So you solve all those problems, those anxieties between Republicans, those friction between Democrats and Republicans. Number two, if you don't have a voter ID in this country, you're a second-class citizen. You can't get a bank account. You can't open a bank account.
Wow, okay.
You can't. That means if you get your Social Security check, and a lot of Americans are living like this. You get your Social Security check or your paycheck, you have to go to a check casher, and that guy's taking 10%.
Exactly.
Oh, it's already hard to be poor,
Yeah.
and everything makes it harder. You can't get on an airplane. You can't get a hotel room.
Mm-hmm.
You can't visit your child at school without a government-issued photo ID.
Yeah.
So your life is terrible, right? More terrible than it already is, than being poor already makes it. The other thing it does is by getting these photo IDs to everybody is it stops the immigration crisis of the border. Because right now, if you're an employer, let's say you're a construction firm in New York, and you want to hire illegal aliens, it's illegal for you to do that. But all you have to ask for is a Social Security card, and then you check the box. And that's all the government demands of you. Social Security card has no photo on it.
Right.
It's easy to fabricate. They're passed from hand to hand.
It's made out of paper, yeah.
And then they give the guy, they're paying the guy, $7, $8, $12 an hour on a construction site. That firm, these unscrupulous firms who are knowingly doing this because they know they can get away with it, are now bidding for contracts against union shops. So they're screwing everybody. Well, if you just say you can't get a job in this country unless you show a government-issued photo ID, a passport card, and we make sure everybody's got one who's legal, what it means is nobody comes across that border again because everybody is coming across because they want a job. If they know they cannot get a job in the United States of America without that card, they're going to stop coming, and that solves the problem overnight.
I love it. You're a partner with Vantage Point Capital Partners?
I was. They're now gone.
Okay. Well, but at the time, it was one of the world's largest clean tech venture capital firms. And you guys were the largest pre-IPO investor in Tesla?
Yes.
Okay. I've owned 4 Teslas. It's by far my favorite car.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you. Great car. I have a Model X Plaid now,
My son
which
just
is the best
bought
car I've ever
My son
owned.
just bought one. He bought a used one. What do you think of that idea?
I bought a used one at one point.
You did?
It's cool. A new one's
I was
better
worried
though.
because you can't get a warranty, and I thought if that battery dies.
Yeah, well, I bought it directly from Tesla, which had the extended warranty at the time. But now I have a new one. By far the best cars ever. According to the internet, you have a net worth of $15 million. Is that more or less accurate?
I don't know. I didn't get any of that Tesla money.
No? Why didn't you get the Tesla money?
Well, actually, the guy who was running Vantage Point was got in a very bad fight with Elon. This guy was a very acerbic Silicon Valley venture capital. He was one of these, sort of alpha male, double X testosterone guys who got in a bad fight with Elon, and Elon actually writes a lot of, I think I would describe as vitriolic description of his relationship with this guy. They didn't like each other, and Vantage Point bailed out of Tesla very early, and I think they sold out all of their stake to Mercedes-Benz, and I think they only got maybe 4 or 5x. Whereas if they'd hold on to that stake, they'd have made 5,000x.
Oh, yeah. I kick myself for not buying Tesla stock back in 2015 when I bought my first Tesla. I own stock now, but I wish I'd bought back then. If you were pre-IPO, oh my God.
Yeah, but my deal with Vantage Point would only apply to companies that I was involved in. So I wouldn't have gotten a piece of that Tesla stake anyway. And, so I don't know what my net worth is, probably a little north of that, but I don't know.
Got it. Okay, so let's lead into why you're here today. In a speech in New Hampshire, you said you were considering running for president. You said, I was thinking about it. I've passed the biggest hurdle, which is my wife has greenlit it. Now, originally, you wanted to be a candidate for the Democratic nomination. Now, I looked it up. The last time an incumbent president wasn't elected by their party was Franklin Pierce in 1856.
That was what? That wasn't elected by their party?
Yeah, meaning that.
What do you mean?
Meaning that an incumbent president that was about to run for a second term, the Democratic Party didn't want them to run again. So what I'm saying is that when you have a president that's done a first term, they're almost always, nominated by their party to do the second term. So why did you originally want to run for Democratic president?
Well, first of all, I'm a Democrat. I was born a Democrat. My family is the iconic,
right,
family in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, which would have meant that you probably would have ran after Biden's second term if he had a second term.
Yeah, but I wasn't sitting around looking to run for president. I didn't ever intend to run for president. I ran for president because what I saw happening in this country, and particularly the Democratic Party, I felt like I was in a unique position to save the country from what's happening. The Ukraine war was one of the issues, the censorship that I saw going on, the government orchestrated censorship of individuals who were criticizing government policies never happened before in our country, and orchestrated by the Democratic Party. And then this corrupt merger of state and corporate power, which is strip mining the middle class in this country of its wealth, of its equity, destroying Black communities. There's going to be no equity in Black communities by 2030, and just destroying quality of life in our country in all communities, the Rust Belt, the Farm Belt, our urban areas, and this disintegration. And I felt like because I'd been on the forefront for so many years of addressing fighting the issue of corporate capture of our regulatory agencies, that I was in a really good position to unravel it, and that a lot of my history with democratic values put me in a position where I really felt like I had to speak out on it.
Well, on October 9th of this year, you announced you're running as an independent, which makes you the 5th member of your family to seek presidency of the United States. Now, as an independent, it's sort of a, different situation. The last person I felt that ran as independent and made some sort of progress was Ross Perot. And Ross Perot, what he essentially did was he split the Republican vote. And like George H.W. Bush blamed him for not getting a second term. You never have seen an independent actually win the presidency. So is your goal to win the presidency, or is it to gain a certain amount of power based on your vote and do certain deals that will help some of the causes that you're looking to?
No, it's to win the presidency.
Okay, so you're trying to win the presidency.
Yeah.
Okay. How realistic do you think that is?
I think it's realistic. Ross Perot was winning. He was beating both Bush and
Clinton.
and Gore. He had 39% of the
Gore?
vote. What?
Was it Clinton, I think?
No, Bush and Gore. Right?
No.
Oh, was it
because-
Bush and Clinton?
Bush and Clinton, yeah.
What year was it? Was it 2000 or it was 96?
He ran for independent in 92.
Yeah, okay, so 92.
Yeah.
He was at
He
got up to
96, I believe.
he got up to 39%.
Yeah, a lot.
Well, he was beating both of them.
Yeah.
So he was leading. And then there were threats against his daughter, and he withdrew. And then when he got back in, he never was able to recover. So it's quite possible that if he had stayed in, that he would have won. But also today, at that point, I think there was only 20% of Americans were registered independents. Today, more than 50%, or somewhere around 50% are.
Wait, 50% are registered as independent?
Independent. It's between 40 and 50%.
Okay.
So it's the biggest party today.
Okay, well, your family spoke about you running. There was a signed statement by 4 of your siblings.
You know how many people I have in my family?
A lot.
105.
105.
Yeah.
So four people from your family, a Maryland Lieutenant Governor Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, former Representative Joseph Kennedy II, Rory Kennedy, and Kerry Kennedy. They said the decision of our brother Bobby to run as a third-party candidate against Joe Biden is dangerous to our country. Bobby might share the same name as our father, but he does not share the same values, vision, or judgment. Today's announcement is deeply saddening for us. We denounce his candidacy and believe it to be perilous for our country. When you hear that from your siblings, what do you think?
You know what? I'm okay with it. I was raised in a family where we argue with each other. My father encouraged us to argue and debate every night. In fact, they orchestrated debates the same way my grandfather did with them. So, there's a lot of things I disagree with my family on. We were on different sides during the Obama. When Obama ran, I was on one side, they were on the other. And there's a lot of issues that I don't agree with any of those people on the war. I don't agree with them on censorship. I have 5 members of my family who are working for the administration. I have President Biden has a bust of my father behind him in the Oval Office. My family has a long, long relationship with them. And, I'm sure, those 4 particular people are horrified. And I'm running against somebody who they consider a friend. Oh, I'm able to love people with whom I disagree. And, so I'm okay with them doing, whatever, of expressing themselves. But I don't think it affects my candidacy at all.
Well, you've said one of your platforms is that the American government is dominated by corporate power. You said the Environmental Protection Agency was run by the oil industry, the coal industry, and the pesticide industry, and the Food and Drug Administration is overly dominated by Big Pharma.
Big Pharma, and also, the industrialized food processors, and Big Ag as well.
Mm-hmm. What's going to be the first thing you do if you get elected president?
The first thing I do?
Yes.
Like the first day?
Yeah, the first day.
The first day, I'm gonna free Julian Assange. I'm gonna free Edward Snowden. I'm gonna pardon them.
Okay.
I'm gonna issue an executive order forbidding any federal employee from collaborating with social media sites to censor political speech in this country. I'm gonna issue an order that passport cards are going to be now available at 33,000 post offices around the country for anybody who needs them. I'm going to go down to Bethesda, to NIH headquarters, and I'm going to speak with the employees sometime in that first week and say that, we're now going to focus on chronic disease, and we're going to have good science, and we're going to open up the databases to the public, and we're going to cure chronic disease. We're going to end the chronic disease pandemic in this country. And then, in the first 90 days, I'm going to start the process of winding down the empire abroad and bringing, closing. I'm going to do a base closure commission for 800 bases we've got abroad. I'm going to figure out which ones we can close and how we can cut our military budget from $900 billion a year to $500 billion a year. I can go on.
Well, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I appreciate you coming in and doing this interview. And I'll be honest, a few months ago in an interview when I interviewed Matt Hoffa, I said that I wouldn't do an interview with you. You interviewed Robert F. Kennedy.
Yes, I did.
You interviewed Robert F. Kennedy.
I did.
That was one that I wouldn't do
Why?
because of all the conspiracy theory shit.
He didn't. If you watched the interview,
I didn't watch the interview.
We didn't really dive into any conspiracy.
Because that's his thing.
Yeah.
COVID is fake and blah, 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 blah. Because of some of your stances about COVID, which I disagree with. But ultimately, when I looked into your story and I saw all the good that you did in terms of your environmental work and everything else like that, I realized I need to get off my high horse. Except that people will have different opinions than me on certain things. And that doesn't mean that they don't deserve a platform and don't deserve a place to speak on VladTV. And what you've done over the course of your life has been phenomenal. I think that, the amount of companies that you've sued that was dumping toxins in our environment and everything else like that is, something they don't speak about enough. When they talk about your name, they focus on more of the gossip and everything else like that, but they don't talk about all the good work that you did. So, congratulations on your journey. And, I'm looking forward to see how this race develops.
Thank you, Vlad. And let me say something to you.
Mm-hmm.
On COVID, I would bet that if you and I actually spent time talking about it, that you'd find that you probably agree with me on almost everything that I feel about COVID. I think a lot of people who disagree with me about how we handled the COVID pandemic are people who are reading mainstream media reports about what I said rather than actually looking at statements that I made.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the problem, is that a lot of what I've said has been distorted and mischaracterized. People believe I'm anti-vax and that, a lot of other things about me that aren't true.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, maybe we can talk about that one day.
Absolutely.
And find some common ground.
Yeah. I mean, we're all going to have disagreements. No one's going to sit down with me and have the exact same views that I do. So I respect the views that you have, and hopefully likewise. But thank you so much for sharing your views, and thank you so much for just telling your story, because your family is so legendary and will always be legendary. And, it's really an honor to sit down with you and talk the way we did today.
Thank you, Vlad. It was an honor to be with you, too.
Absolutely. Peace.